Good evening, everyone. And of course, good morning to some of you out there. And maybe this is the beauty of being able now to virtually connect and be together in this session. Although it's really awkward not to be physically there and meeting everyone, hearing your expressions, and being in real contact as we used to. However, this is an unprecedented times, and this is a session that talks exactly about unprecedented human crisis, which is the right to belong. My name is Zena Yazaji. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. I welcome you all into connecting with our session through the website, the platforms of C20, social media accounts and platforms. Would love to hear all your thoughts, all your questions, and I promise we will try to answer it as time allows. Let me start first by welcoming our dear panelists and esteemed speakers. First, we welcome on board Gillian Triggs. She's the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the UNHCR, Protection and Operations, I believe. Also, we have Christine Mendonça, CAO of Humans on the Move. I don't know, you get to see the picture shortly. And we have Sahar Atrash, the Senior Advocate for the Middle East Refugees International, and also Shadia El Maoushi, a board member and at the Teach for Lebanon. I welcome you all, everyone who's on connecting with us in any way, virtually, of course. Of course, I have to tell you, this is the biggest virtual gathering of civil society at the C20, trying to channel our opinion, everyone's opinion, into the coming G20. The session is The Right to Belong, an Unprecedented Human Crisis, and it is indeed. 79.5 million around our world are now, as we speak at this moment, are living. They don't feel they belong, not welcomed, neither by their fellow citizens nor by governing laws or legislations. It was hard enough to be forced to leave home, not when they chose, and not for the reasons they have dreamt of, maybe. They were forced to leave everything, and many times everyone dear to them. They wanted to survive, escape wars, injustice, and reckless threats, and death at many cases. With this number, 79.5 million, we need to hear it many times, unfortunately, we announced that our world is witnessing the highest level of displacement in history. It doesn't sit right, does it? A word we proudly call now most modern, highest advanced, best connected, but you would expect it to be also most humanitarian, best inclusive. It should have figured out how to protect its people, the mighty and the weak, the rich and the poor, the male and the female, the elderly and the young. Every member of this word should feel secure, accepted, valuable. Belonging is such a simple word for a huge concept. It's a human basic, indeed. So what are we doing? What are we doing as individuals, as societies, and of course, governments and international bodies to take responsibilities for the right to belong? Many steps have been taken by hosting countries to enhance the inclusiveness of refugees, for example. I've witnessed that. But the struggle to establish these examples as international practices and mandate is not yet there. So dare we dream of an immediate global action that turns sore realities into hopeful opportunities and a no entry banner into a welcome sign? Through bringing global attention to the ways in which these marginalized groups are systematically excluded and victimized, both the struggles and necessary solutions will be highlighted, or that's what we hope. In this understanding, this session intends to explore what it means to live as a marginalized group, a displaced person, a people who are stateless, a migrant, asylum seekers, and refugees. What the life of a person facing exclusion looks like, having minimum belonging, fighting to keep well being and health, worried about food and sanitation, education and protection, wondering about a job, and facing gender problems. Mind you, these concerns and worries that might actually face anyone at one time or another, but not every day and nonstop. These concerns become the realities of these groups. We also aim at this session to prospect on the actions required of our world leaders to bring justice and dignity to the lives of these individuals, ensuring the right to belong for all. In the session, particularly, we aim to shed the light on displacement and statelessness as a major crisis worsened by legislation and policies that are non inclusive and discriminatory, therefore, leaving the group identified above, they're leaving them behind. Civil society calls on the G20 to reform their current legislation and policies throughout different sectors and to adapt and adopt inclusive and integrated responses to combat the problems of statelessness. G20 countries must implement a strong framework of legislation and policy that are equitable and non discriminatory in different areas to allow these groups to be well integrated in societies and given the opportunities of a decent life. This will ensure rehabilitation, reintegration, and meeting the diverse needs of these vulnerable groups of our society. Without saying anything further, I here give the I would say the podium, but let's say the place and the words, the microphone and the video to Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection and Operations at UNHCR. You're most welcome on this session, Gillian. Would love to hear what you have to say, especially that this is exactly what you're dealing with, and this is exactly what you ask for as a UNHCR, and from your background as a commissioner who've been involved heavily in international laws. Let me just give a very quick introduction about you. It's an honor, actually. It's a very long, honorable CV. Just try to cut it short. Gillian Triggs is an international lawyer who has held a number of eminent opponents in service to human rights and the refugee cause. Most recently as the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and Triggs oversees UNHCR protection work, as we mentioned, for millions of refugees, internally displaced, stateless, and other people of concern. A national of Britain and Australia, she has held many international leadership roles as a lawyer and an academic on public international law. You're welcome on the opening remarks, Gillian. Here you go. Okay, we lost Julian, unfortunately. All right, let's move on. I think it's only a technical problem where we're all new to this word. So, but this is the beauty of a human race, isn't it? We always find a way to overcome. We always turn around, and at the end, we find a good way to continue and to be there. Let me move on to Christine Mendoza. Christine is the CEO of Humans on the Move. She's a social impact advisory focused on connecting private, humanitarian, and public sectors to rethink the responses to the global forced displacement. She's also the founder of many advisory firms and working groups to help refugees and forced displacement to have a voice that is well heard. And this is the voice we would like to hear from you, Cristina Mendoza. Here you go with your remarks, opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you. It's an honor to be here and to speak with all of you. If there's a sliver of silver lining to all of this, it's that we're able to have more voices in the room, to be more inclusive, and hear more perspectives from around the globe. In founding Humans on the Move, our attempt was to bring together the public, private, and humanitarian sectors so they could collectively address the challenges and opportunities that we are facing in communities that are hosting those who are seeking refuge. However, with COVID-19, it's impacted all of us. It's impacted how we operate our organizations. It's impacted how countries respond to and communities are responding to those seeking refuge. I think one of the bigger things is that COVID-19 has hit communities, members that are most marginalized the hardest, and that's including refugees, stateless, and internally displaced persons. One of the key themes we consistently see in every community that's supporting those seeking refuge is that the local communities have the infrastructure to support those within their community, but need support from others so they can have a more robust infrastructure to support those who are seeking refuge there. So they need governments as well as humanitarian actors to take a holistic approach to build that capacity. While those seeking refuge may have different legal needs than the marginalized within the communities that they're seeking to live in, they have very similar basic needs and very similar psychosocial needs in those communities. Excuse me. There's often a saying that, like, when you're out in nature hiking, that you should leave no trace and leave no trace behind. However, while I think it's the opposite is true for these communities that are hosting those seeking refuge. As a global actors, whether it's governments, humanitarian sector leaders, the private sector, as we look to address the needs in communities and providing the right to belong and a sense of community, the onus is on us into helping build and expand the capacity within the local infrastructure to support the basic needs, psychosocial support, access to healthcare, access to education, access to supportive programming, and that's a critical component, so that when organizations leave and go to the next crisis or challenge, the next community, that host community has the resources that they need to support everyone that's there. And I think the bigger process is that governments and all of the stakeholders within the G20 need to really focus and find ways on how to address the rise of right-wing extremism within our communities, whether that's here in the United States or abroad. We need to, as a collective society, address the rising anti-immigrant sentiments, because fear of the other is not going to help any of us address the challenges that are faced around the globe. Thank you. I'm going to pass it along to Ms. Triggs.
Sentiments. I think this is something we could discuss further on. But now let's move on to the other opening remarks. Let's move to Sahar. Do we have, just a quick question, do we have Jillian with us, or shall we move on to Sahar? Okay. I think Ms. Jillian Triggs is with us. Hi again. Sorry for the interruption. The realities of belonging to the virtual world. All right. So Let me just catch up on introducing you. Ms. Jillian Triggs, she's, of course, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR. She's an international lawyer who has held a number of eminent appointments in service to human rights and the refugee cause. Most recently, as the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Triggs oversees UNHCR's protection work for millions of refugees, internally displaced, stateless, and other people of concern. She's a national of Britain and Australia, and she has held many international leadership roles as a lawyer and an academic on public international law. It's lovely to have you, and very good on this topic. Of course, the right to belong. It's an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and the UNHCR has told us it is the first and the highest in the history of humanity. What do you have to say about that?
Well, thank you, Zina, and thank you, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm sorry there was a bit of an internet difficulty, but I'm with you now, and the biggest ever gathering of civil society groups. It's a huge honour for me to be part of this. Zina, thank you for your introduction. I think you very, very lucidly captured the key points, really, that we're interested in order to discuss this topic, the right to belong. And I think you've pointed out, and I think it will probably be repeated over this session many times, that at the UN Agency for Refugees, we reported last year about 80 million forcibly displaced from their homes, who are now asylum seekers, refugees, or displaced within their own country. It's very likely that these numbers are significantly increased this year, but there are also unknown millions of people who are stateless, all under UNHCR's mandate within the UN system. Well, the plight of these people has been significantly worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's created an even bigger humanitarian pandemic, the effects of which we are very fearful at UNHCR will be felt for many months, if not years to come. In thinking about the right to belong, I'd like at this meeting to stress the importance of civil society in meeting the needs of those who've been forcibly displaced. Of course, at UNHCR, we've worked alongside with civic society groups in emergency responses for many, many years. But COVID has demonstrated more clearly than ever before the importance of local communities, of pro bono legal aid workers, faith-based groups, mayors, local governments, schools, and universities. They all provide support to the most vulnerable. They stay and they deliver. Other humanitarian groups may be subject to visa permissions, contracts, funding, but local community organizations stay and help, whatever the circumstances. UNHCR is very grateful for the assistance of civil society in these troubling times, both as frontline responders who are best able to assess the needs of local communities, but also as highly effective advocates for the most vulnerable. Well, what does it really mean to be displaced? It means, above all else, that a person becomes vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. People forced from their homes by conflict, persecution, environmental degradation, poverty, inequality, and racism, you all know this as well as I, are usually dependent on the informal economy. And that, of course, has declined significantly in the pandemic. The displaced people are often the first to lose their jobs. They're subject to eviction for rental defaults. Women are vulnerable to rising gender-based violence, and their children are more likely to be out of school for longer periods. Especially, sadly, girls, we seem to be seeing a setback to the opportunities for young girls to have an education. But additionally, those displaced are often the object of stigmatization and xenophobia. In this time of COVID, people who are displaced often struggle to find employment and shelter. Their family cohesion breaks down, leading to spikes in sexual-based violence, including against children, who become vulnerable to early marriage, to labor exploitation, and recruitment into armed services. At the UN Refugee Agency, we're also observing increased mental illness and despair among those that we're tasked to protect. In short, COVID-19 has brought further social and economic distress to those who don't belong, compounding an existing refugee crisis. The impact of not belonging on those forcibly displaced can often, however, lie in the detail. And I've recently returned from missions for the UN Refugee Agency in Malta and in Greece. And I've been especially struck by the disconnect, the gap between the laws that are put in place by governments and the realities on the street. Even in this time of COVID, it's been gratifying, of course, that most nations have allowed refugees access to health services and education. Some have even permitted access to the job market. But these policies and laws, if they exist, do not necessarily translate at the local level. I've spoken to people living on the streets who have full legal refugee status, but who do not have access to employment, accommodation, or social services because they don't have a social security number or a tax file number. And without these, you cannot have access to a bank account. And so it goes on in a truly Kafkaesque way, leading to utter desperation. All that I've described applies equally, and perhaps more so, to those who don't have birth certificates and who are not recognized as the nationals of any country. Without citizenship, they're truly isolated and excluded from the usual benefits of belonging. At UNHCR, we've embarked on a 10-year campaign to end statelessness by 2024. It's an ambitious goal and one that is making some progress in some countries. Indeed, some nations have found to their surprise that there are stateless people within their territory, and they've done their best in good faith to register them and put them on a path to citizenship. But other countries have chosen deliberately to exclude those who are stateless, to deny birth certificates to children born in the country, and to deny women the right to pass on their nationality to their children, perpetuating statelessness for yet another generation. While at UNHCR, we've long understood the risks of not belonging among refugees and those who are stateless, we're now more aware of the plight of those who've been forcibly displaced in their own country, usually as a consequence of conflict. Those displaced in Idlib, in the north of Syria, are a particular and recent example. And just over the last few days, thousands of people have fled violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, adding to the estimated 47 million internally displaced people globally. All too often, even while living in their own country, those displaced may not have access to schools, health services, and accommodation, and in flight have often left behind their documentation that proves their citizenship and identity. Well, I've described the problem. The question, and the one that I really would like to hear your views about, is what can we do? What can be done? More specifically, what can civil society do for such a global crisis? Well, as many of you know, 181 countries, the overwhelming majority of nations, have agreed to the Global Compact on Refugees and to the principle of solidarity and sharing of responsibility for all those displaced. I suggest that this principle of responsibility sharing provides a blueprint for the future, given concrete implementation by the Pledging Forum last December of 1,400 pledges. Admittedly, COVID-19 has tested the principle of solidarity, but we're encouraged by recent recommitment to the principle by UN members just last week. A key to responsibility sharing is the role of civil society as advocates and as humanitarians. We're working with many, including very recently Religions for Peace, a peak body of most faith-based groups, and the High Commissioner has agreed to establish an advisory council of leaders to assist us all in working at the local level to support communities. We're also working with city mayors and the business community to garner financial and other support for refugees and the displaced. So I very much look forward to hearing your views and suggestions to strengthen the work that we all do to be sure that everyone belongs. And in the words of the UN Secretary General, we have to be sure that as the pandemic subsides, and it surely will, we leave no one behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed hearing every word, and I love what you said. Like, let's see what can civil society do to solve the problems. You actually described the problem in the very true details. Also, like when you visit the camps and the displaced cities, you actually go people. You actually notice that very small details just get them into this vicious circle of not belonging, and how to go back to be into their societies and communities. Thank you so much for these opening remarks. Let me go on to Ms. Sahar. Sahar, welcome on board on the session. Let me just introduce you very quickly. Sahar is the senior advocate for the Middle East at Refugees International. Sahar was the senior advocacy officer at the Syrian American Medical Society, and where she led research and advocacy efforts around Syria's policy and the humanitarian issues in the United States and the Middle East. Sahar was also a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group, where her policy reports and articles were the basis of direct international advocacy and media engagement. Her research took her to refugee camps and conflict zones throughout the region, and Sahar also served with the United Nations in Lebanon, where she coordinated post-conflict relief and reconstruction in a Palestinian refugee camp. She previously worked with several Lebanese and international NGOs on projects aiming at socioeconomic development, empowering vulnerable groups, and improving governance, all to the core of what we're looking for now, which is the answer to what can civil society do to solve the problem of not belonging, or at least to empower the not belonging. Sahar, we're all listening to your opening remarks.
Thank you, Zaina. It's really an honor to be here. Just very quickly, I work for Refugees International. Refugees International is an advocacy organization. So we basically advocate for the right of refugees, internally displaced, and all marginalized groups. And indeed, my work take me, fortunately, to, or maybe sometimes unfortunately, to many of these regions, refugee camps, but also places affected by conflict. I cover part of the Middle East, basically Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Palestine. So all 6 countries that has been really affected by dictatorships, conflict, economic hardships, and in some even instances, climate, change. So in all these different countries, we really witnessed displacement, very firsthand, if I can say so. And if I can start with a very general remark, the right to belong is for many of the people I meet and interview is a luxury. They're even looking for much more basic and much more limited rights than the right to belong. But I'll come to this and I'll try to limit my time to 5 minutes. I'm gonna give very quick example from these countries that I cover. So Syria, nearly a decade of conflict has displaced half of the pre-war population. Around a little bit less than 6 million Syrian refugees, mostly in the region, but also across the world, and more than 6 million internally displaced in Syria. And Gillian mentioned Idlib. Idlib just last year, before the outbreak of the COVID-19, went through a military escalation, and nearly 1 million people were displaced. Idlib has been the host for all Syrians who's been displaced in areas from Syria. So it's already a very overcrowded governorate in northwest Syria. The situation was so bad that some refugees had to take refuge under olive trees. Thousands of Syrian displaced had nowhere to go but to stay, literally take an olive tree as their only refuge, just to say, how the hardship they go through. Lebanon is mostly a host for Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees, but now Lebanon is on the brink of collapse. And the economic hardship is really pushing marginalized Lebanese group, but also Syrians and Palestinian and other marginalized group to take the very dangerous trip by boat to seek, a safer or a more place for more decent living. Palestinian refugees, I mean, we all know the plight of Palestinian refugees. We're talking about 7.2 million Palestinian refugees across the globe. Just recently, we published a report on Gaza. Gaza, on top of the COVID-19, is also dealing with a decade long of blockade. We see in Gaza what we called a quarantine within a quarantine. Yemen is another place where conflict has really pushed an already, I would say, underdeveloped country to the brink of famine. There's around 3 million people displaced inside Yemen, and most of them really live in very, very hard conditions. And of course, we all know the situation in Iraq, where in the past 2 or 3 decades, Iraqis has been suffering conflict and violence, pushing more and more people, to seek safety, either in within the country or outside the country. I want to very quickly say what displacement mean, and I really hope I can relay at least the voices of the people I meet and I talk to. Displacement doesn't just mean losing a house. Displacement literally, basically means losing a life. People leave everything behind. Most of the time, they have lost family members. They have even had to leave, in Syria, for example, the grave of their beloved ones. All their memories, their IDs sometimes, the education certificates, they leave everything behind. And they have to start a new life somewhere else where they're most of the time not welcome. In Syria, for example, in Idlib, as we talked about Idlib, on average, people have been displaced more than 5 times, some even up to 10 times. I cannot, explain what this means. To be on the move nonstop, just packing a mattress sometimes and a few clothing because you know that you're not going to be able to stay for a long time. I want to also talk about the vulnerability, the lack of access to the most basic needs: health, education, water, shelter. People usually, when are displaced, they lose the access to all these most basic needs. But most importantly, I think, or maybe as important, is the loss of rights. We can talk about, all these different cases, but let me give an example of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, where they have no right to work. The freedom of movement is obstructed. They face discrimination. They face, all type of abuses and exploitation. So this is just all to speak to the how dire the situation is. I want to end on very quickly, though, because I gave a very grim picture of the region I cover. I want to end on a positive note. Despite all this hardship, every time I go into refugee camps, or I'm hosted by marginalized individuals or displaced people, I'm amazed. I'm really fascinated by their courage, by their generosity. They're really to offer the little that they have. And the courage, of people, for example, in Syria who've lost siblings, who've lost fathers and mother, who really want to go on and make a change. I'm going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sahar. I mean, you're right. It is a glim picture. I know their resilience is outstanding in every sense. But then you're right. We're here to find solutions, solutions, and solutions, and to give them that olive tree as a refugee, but a really refugee that they can on. Thank you very much, Sahar. Let me now go on and introduce to you Shadia El-Mayoush. Shadia is a board member of Teach for Lebanon. Shadia El-Mayoushi, she's managing partner of Badri and Salim El-Mayoushi law firm, a leading regional law firm in the Middle East, and is a member of the New York Bar. Shadia has been recognized by Financial News as amongst the top 50 most influential women in the Middle East finance. That was in 2019, and many other top rankings, actually. Shadia is a board member of various companies, an author and a public speaker, and she's also a visiting professor. Shadia is also a co-founder in various leading education technology startups and a co-founder and board member of various NGOs, institutions, including Teach for Lebanon, the Human Rights Watch Committee for Lebanon, and Equality Now, among others. Hi, Shadia. It's good to have you here on this session. Let's hear what you have to say about the session, the right to belong as unprecedented human crisis from your perspective.
Thank you very much, Zena, and greetings to everyone. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So I come from Lebanon, a country that's seen in the last year revolution, an economic collapse, above 50% unemployment rate, 60% of our population is in poverty, COVID-19 is hitting strong like everywhere else, and the latest blast that caused death, injuries, and destruction of more than 300,000 homes. On top of all this, Lebanon hosts actually the most refugees per capita in the world and has approximately 2 million refugees for a population of 4.5 million Lebanese. So it's as if you suddenly had around 120 million refugees show up in the US. So you'll rightfully question how a country like Lebanon can actually cope with these refugees. And I will answer you that it can't, but that it must, because the right to belong is sacred and undeniable, and it's at the heart of what makes us human. But we can't cope alone. A key problem is that the developing low-income countries actually host and bear 85% of the weight of refugees right now, while the richest countries take only 15%. From my visits to refugee camps in Lebanon, I can assure you that the life of a refugee is very harsh. Refugees actually live in around 12 camps or in poor rentals across the country or in informal tent settlements. They don't have any formal citizenship, even if some of them have actually been in Lebanon for more than 40 years. They have no certainty for their future, little social, economic, or political liberties, close to none, and poor living conditions. Families in Lebanon can survive on less than $2.9 per person per day. They also have limited job and educational opportunities. So in Lebanon, most jobs are reserved for the nationals. Refugees can live but can't work. And most refugees are actually youth under the age of 24, the majority of them. And they have challenges to access education because of the language and having also to work to support their families. And so 60% of school-age refugees are currently out of school. On top of that, they're actually despised by the host community. Government has made their life harder to push them to leave. They fear detention, deportation. Government have forced employers to fire them or charging them with huge fines unless they obtain residency and work permits for long term for these refugees. And as my colleagues have said, they face discrimination. So what's the solution? Right now, many players provide some relief. So UNHCR, of course, and a myriad of NGOs and governments through aid programs. So one example, at Teach for Lebanon, our mission is to recruit university graduate fellows. We train them, and then we place them in schools across the country in economically challenged areas. Since 2008, we've hired and trained close to 200 alumni and provided quality education to close to 32,000 children in around 60 schools. And a third of these children are refugees. We ensure that refugees are part of all our programs. We also teach our students about human rights and inclusivity as part of the program. At Al-Fanar, another NGO that I sit on the board of, we've also implemented many programs to help refugees, from education, health protection, and job and economic opportunity. But we often face donors who just won't give funds if those funds don't go to the Lebanese kids only. And this makes me very sad. Unfortunately, all these efforts of civil society and UNHCR are amazing efforts, but they're not sufficient. So some solutions for host countries like Lebanon might include, so I always think, what could we do? What could we do to actually help find a solution to the problem? You have to first accept that it's a collective problem and a collective responsibility, and that we need a collective and comprehensive effort to solve it, and that there's an interest to do that. Wealthy countries need to put their share of funding, which they're not doing right now. You have to provide full-fledged support to host countries like Lebanon, and you have to compel them to ratify and enforce the UN conventions for refugees. So right now, Lebanon hasn't even ratified the UN Convention of 1951. And when you look at the state of the refugee camps and the refugees, most host countries are not even enforcing the human rights conventions protecting refugees, even if they signed them. So you can't host so many refugees and not be accountable to ensuring them standards. Another way I thought was the international community, when financing and providing investments to those host countries, should condition that on those host countries that they involve and that they employ also the refugees as well as the host countries unemployed. Another way is also to grant trade and export incentives or concessions to countries that are hosting refugees, provided that they actually provide jobs to refugees. But most importantly is to have a comprehensive solution that helps the host countries with local integration, resettlement of the most vulnerable, or voluntary repatriation. The refugees can't all stay. We have no excuses, really, none. Economically, there are solutions to the problem. All it takes is political will and enlightened leadership. I'm an anomaly on this panel in that my main job and platforms don't include the protection of refugees as my main purpose, contrary to my fellow panelists that I very much admire. But I want to deliver a message that every person, every entity can make a difference. Revise your purpose and your mission so that you include the marginalized and the refugees. If every NGO, every company, every government were to actually incorporate the support of refugees into all their programs, this would be a huge step in the immediate term. The last thought I want to leave you with is one of compassion. I always imagine that the refugee is my son or my daughter, and then I remind myself that they actually are, because there is and there must be no other. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
This is could be your child, your daughter, or your boy. And I know this is very sentimental. You write about it. Also, I loved what you said about collective. This is a collective problem that should come into collective interest to solve it. Let me go further in the discussion with you, Shadia, and ask you, what impact does the exclusion of marginalized groups have on society as a whole? So basically what we're trying to read here, if that political will you mentioned, if that civil inclusiveness, civil society inclusiveness and responsibility on the part of the business to take into the refugees' interest into their businesses or their employment. If that doesn't happen, what are the setbacks or the reflections would be on the societies, on the hosting societies, when you live for long, having excluded marginalized groups amongst you, but they're not belonging?
Yeah, so Julian Triggs and many of my colleagues talked about, what happens when you're excluded. So it becomes very difficult for you to have a voice in society. It leads to an impoverishment of your human lives, and it develops a poorer sense of your well-being. And it leads to inequality, poverty, unemployment, and involuntary migration. It also leads to child labor and early marriage. So the statistics is that out of women between the ages of 20 and 24, half of them are actually married before they're 18. So child marriage, what it also leads to lower education levels, and then lower education leads to lack of independence and involvement in the workforce. It's all, unfortunately, a vicious circle, and you face so many issues on your society. The other issue is crime. So it's claimed that the crime rate in Lebanon actually increased 50% with the influx of refugees. I think this is an exaggerated number, but there is no denying that crime rate does increase when people are left out. And when crime rate increases, everything follows again. Businesses won't open their businesses in the neighborhoods, jobs won't be created, and those neighborhoods will decline. The other concern, I think, is the tensions. It causes real tensions between refugees and the host community when you actually exclude. The reality is the longer you let the gap between the world and the refugees grow, the more problems and tensions and polarities we create, and the more people are left out and can be a prey to abusers and indoctrinators. It's actually no secret that child soldiers and recruitment by ISIS is often made to refugees. But I actually prefer to look at it from the other angle. So you asked, what impact does exclusion have? But what impact does inclusion have on the society as a whole? And you've seen, for example, in Germany, a 1% increase in GDP was seen after having successfully integrated refugees. They're an amazing pool of labor, particularly in aging countries, so like the European countries. Refugees are a very important consumer base. And then migrants also play a very important role in the development of their home countries, because through remittances, transferring of technology and knowledge, and it actually eventually leads to innovation and growth. And that's not to forget also the refugees expenditure actually is a big economic stimulus package to economies. Because you get funds to build houses, to have resources available for them. So if you're able to successfully integrate them, there's just there's only advantages to a society. I always think China actually lifted 800 million out of poverty. How come the entire world is not able to solve a crisis for 80 million? It's just astounding to me.
Right. I think you touched on some of the reasons. And probably your answer might also always answer the statement we hear in suffering countries, like in not doing very well, like in Lebanon and other countries. They just go and tell you, well, the displaced, the stateless, the refugees are adding to our burden. If we were okay, we would have them in, but then we're suffering to begin with. But the impact of having them on economic, on businesses and finance, you just highlighted, might actually help in answering those concerns of the local communities. Let me move to Sahar, ask you a few questions. Sahar Al-Atrash. Sahar, how does the life of a refugee? I know you described it, but I also know that the details do not stop. Like you wouldn't know till you go there and you start diving in their word and be shocked by every detail they're suffered from. Like they have to pay for renting the land, the small, if you call it the land, the small land they put their tent on. That was a big surprise for me, for example. Or in Madagascar, in Bangladesh, when I saw the kids, they just lived there for ages, not having any right, and they were peaceful with it. That also shocked me. So when you go and touch them, and this is basically what you do in your work, how does it look different from ours? And you know where this question is coming from, because we still now, till after all these years, we still need to explain the problem, unfortunately.
Yes, and this is very unfortunate. Let me just bring a little bit of nuance to the refugee, let's say, label. So, because I don't want, for everybody to come out of this conversation thinking that every single refugee is living in a refugee camp and marginalized and have no rights. So when we're talking about refugees, like there are some wealthy people who've been displaced from their countries, and they have, unfortunately, there's a kind of a class also discrimination when it comes to refugees, if I can say so. But let's talk about the refugees we all have in mind. So people who most of the time live in camps or in informal settlements. It's indeed what you described, Zena, is indeed a very, very right picture, because people, especially when the displacement become protracted, they try to adapt to their life inside these camps. It never becomes okay. It never becomes a decent living, but at least they try to adapt. For example, when you go to refugee camps, civil society actors, most of the time local actors, try to set in a school, informal school, mobile clinics, or even clinics inside
Right. Sahar, I wanted also to ask you, I mean, COVID-19 has definitely been a life changer, a universe changer, a business changer, a big changer of everything. It definitely had its setbacks, heavy setbacks on the life of the displaced and the marginalized group, the refugees and stateless. But I don't know if it's proper to ask, but did it, like, for us, for the communities, for the hosting communities, it gave us few lessons as well. Like this sense of concern about tomorrow, of not being safe in your own home, of not having the will to actually protect your kids or protect yourself. You're just against a way disproportional enemy that you don't know, you can't control your life and build your future accordingly. It gave us some lessons. Did it help into the civil society to accept more the refugees? Like everyone went through this humanitarian awareness moment. Was it collective, or it just had the bad sides on their life?
I really hope that we learned some lessons from the COVID-19, pandemic and the ensuing consequences, especially when with lockdowns and quarantine. I don't know, to be honest. I hope I'll be as optimistic as you are. But I want to draw a few things that I've heard. For example, Syrian refugees led a campaign on Twitter asking people to stay home with picture, of their picture in front of tent, saying we wish we had a home to stay in. So just, to show the gap between what we, like non-displaced people, non-stateless people, are facing, and other. So it's for Syrian refugees, for other refugees, it's a luxury, to be able to stay home. Palestinian refugees I talked to in Gaza, for example, I don't want to be cynical, but for them, they were for once felt that the rest of the world is hopefully understanding what they have been through for decades now, for more than 13 years, because of the, like the blockade and the limitation to their freedom of movement. I really hope that this pandemic will teach us all, like worldwide, a lesson. But I unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is most of the time, the most vulnerable are the one that's also affected. They are left behind in discussions about what needs to be done, about vaccines, access to vaccines, for example, if a vaccine is, found. So I really feel there's a need to keep in mind that at least with COVID-19, the border, the difference between refugees and non-refugees was erased. And we have to keep in mind that we need to include, the inclusion is, and Shadia talked about inclusion, is definitely will lead to very positive, I think, outcome.
Right. Thank you so much, Sahar, for your insight. I would move to Ms. Christine Mendoza. Christine, what reform commitments are needed from the international community and G20 in order to ensure these groups are not left behind?
I think one of the first things is that the international community and the way the funding structures work, there are two things. One is that they're short-term funding. Oftentimes it's only focused on a year and it's only focused on specific populations. So from a global level, for us to really look at, when we talk about funding communities that are hosting refugees or those seeking refuge, we really think about trying to expand that funding so they can actually use it over a longer period of time and can be more sustainable and not have to continually ask for funds on a yearly basis, because it almost feels like a lot of these organizations are in a consistent fundraising program rather than focusing on supporting the needs of the people they're trying to serve. That would be one. The other part would be making sure that these organizations who are serving those seeking refuge are also given funding and allocated funding to serve the greater community, because, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, a lot of the challenges facing refugees and those seeking refuge in communities is the otherism, is the xenophobia, is the discrimination. And that has to do often with like false narratives about who they are and why they're coming, but also the sense of they're getting something that I'm not. I remember being in Beirut in 2017 and meeting with an NGO that works with school children whose name, I think it's ULIP, I think is who it was I was with. And they spoke about how the woman spoke about she had a Lebanese refugee and a Syrian refugees, like working together, kids, and this not Lebanese but local Lebanese, underserved Lebanese, and the young Lebanese child came up to her and said, I really wish I was a Syrian refugee. And she goes, well, why would you ever, why? he goes, well, Syrian refugee has a backpack from UNICEF, has shoes from UNHCR, has clothes from this organization, clothes from that. And all I have is what I have from last year that I've outgrown. So a lot of times there is this almost bizarre kind of inequity that forms amongst these the marginalized communities between the host community as well as there. And so finding structural reforms within how we fund organizations who are supporting refugees and those seeking refuge is really critically important so that we can actually support the community more broadly, so we can broadly address issues that are happening within the community as a whole. So I think that's one. I think when it comes to minors and specifically unaccompanied minors, there are more children on the move than there have ever been in the modern era. And specifically on their own. And governments need to come up with policies to get these minors. And when I say minor, I want to say up to the age of 21. I know that there's different organizations have stipulations on ages and what constitutes a minor. But I'm saying from newborn to 21, get them into home settings or connected with families. Oftentimes, these children are not fleeing with no destination unknown. They've got an idea of where they need to go. It's creating programs and structures and laws in which they can then safely go and reunify with a family that they're looking to reunify with. There are laws in the books, and there's members of the G20 who have made commitments, but their failure to follow through on those commitments is disconcerting is a light word to use. It's frustrating beyond words for civil society organizations who have advocated for children. So that is definitely one. And it needs to be clear, incredibly clear, not just to the children that are involved, but also to the organizations that are trying to help them on how to make this process work. I think the other thing that needs to happen is that we're talking about 79 million people right now, globally displaced, probably more since the report came out of the number of people who have been displaced, forcibly displaced in their homes. Every year, the number has kept up and up and up. We need to have conversations about why people are leaving and who the drivers are of that displacement, and what their responsibilities are to addressing it. Specifically, last month, there was a report that came out from Brown University and they're called the Costs of War, or under their Costs of War program, about creating refugees. So what the United States and its allies' actions on the global war on terror since 9/11, how many people those actions have displaced. They estimated, I think conservatively, 37 million people have been displaced purely on this, based on the actions we've taken on the global war on terror. We need to have a broader conversation on not just what nation state actors are doing, but what companies are doing that might be displacing refugees or displacing human beings, putting them in a path of becoming an asylum seeker and a refugee. And whose responsibility is that, right? And in addition to companies, because I think that it's not just governments who have a responsibility to have a conversation. And the civil society organizations can only do so much. Corporate actors need to be held accountable for not only the actions that they may take that forcibly displace people, but also in understanding their supply chains and their operations, making sure that they're not exploiting those seeking refuge in the communities in which they operate in. So I think that it's really important. And I would say from the corporate perspective, it's important that every stakeholder has access to it, access to understanding what those risks are. So I think there's that.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Christine. Let me just put some questions for everyone. Try to answer here. We're approaching like almost the end now. We still have some time, of course, but let's all put this on the discussion. Shadia, Sahar, Christine, and Dylan, you're most welcome if you'd like to also join the conversation. Let's see what reform commitments are needed from the international community and G20 in order to ensure these groups are not left behind. And this is the main purpose of all the C20, like just pinpoint what is by civil society for the governments and the international communities, what is needed actually, what is working to support it and empower it more and go in that direction, and what is not working, not to waste time and money and resources on, and what could be working. Because apparently, as one, I think it was Shadia said, like, we're finding solutions for everything. How come this issue is left behind and just numbers is going on? And how could we how healthy it is to connect it always with the political will? How dangerous is that? How hindering it is? Or that's inevitable anyway? I want to start with Shadia on like very few, and then we go Sahar, Christine, and then we'll hear the final remarks from Jillian.
So I'd like to second everything that Christine was saying, but I think one thing that we should also consider is how to exploit technology for the better good of resolving this crisis. You can use technology now for education, which Sahar was mentioning. There's a huge education gap for digital identities, for job creation, for skills training, for healthcare, for money management. You can use technology for so many things. And there must be a way of triggering that and developing that. So we, for example, I co-founded a NetTech platform called Leap Learner, where it's called the platform that we provided, which is basically teaches coding for free. It's called iCode. And we have approximately 1 million users now, and we're hoping to increase that to 5 million students within the next 3 years. So this is free access to coding classes. So these kinds of platforms can be provided to refugees. But the challenge is they need access to electricity and to a computer. And you have to also overcome the language challenge. But it's all feasible. But I think technology is a very powerful way to actually address some of the issues. And the other thing I want to say is that you have to, why aren't we exploiting human creativity, the most human creative minds and the innovative minds? Why are we not challenging them to resolve this crisis? So if you take the equivalent, for example, of an X Prize, why don't we say, solutions for resolving the refugee crisis and see what comes out of that? It should become a priority on everyone's mind so that no human being is actually left out. So I would add those two things to the solutions proposed by Christine. Thank you, Zina.
Triggering the online and the advanced technology into taking the part of what's happening, and maybe this like online schooling now, just the shift to it. Everyone, but it is like everyone was on board, was in the same direction. Maybe this is what's missing at this point for the refugees cause, and also Sahar. It was Shadia mentioned creativity and a competition to who could solve and how, and that's really also a good point to put here. Sahar, you want to add some points of what could be done to solve the problem?
Sure. And I find, the idea that Shadia put on the table really interesting. I'm not work in an operational organization, so I want to talk about policies more broadly. For me, the first and most foremost problem is the reason that create these wave of displacement. So we're talking mostly about conflict, about violence, about wars, and maybe to a lesser extent, climate change. I think if we don't really address, and I know, Zena, you talked about political will, so I know I'm not, naive. I know this is really like not going to be solved tomorrow. But if the war in Yemen go on, if the situation in Syria, the war in Idlib renewed, if the economic and political situation in Lebanon doesn't improve, all these, if the blockade in Gaza is not lifted, what we're going to see is more and more crises and hardship that will lead to more refugee flows. So for me, it's really to address for first the root causes of all these problems, conflict, but also injustice and economic marginalization, because in many of these cases, it's not just violence per se, but the marginalization that push people to go and seek better opportunities somewhere. On a more granular level, I would say that there has to be indeed a international will really to support refugees, advocate for them, relay their voices with governments hosting these refugees. Unfortunately, the US, which was supposed to be leading, having a leading role, is now closing its borders in front of refugees, not resettling new refugees and implementing discriminatory policies against refugees. So I feel really like what we need also some operational, measures to improve the lives and the conditions of refugees. But what we also need is policy change within governments, within countries where refugees are hosted, but also on a more global level where the rights of refugees are put, as sacred, if I can say so.
What points do you think would actually, in addition to the points mentioned so far, coming from the civil society, from all your experience and expertise, that could actually solve the problem or help, of course, solve it?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I got a bit of it. I didn't get all of it.
Okay. So we're talking here, we're asking the same question for everyone. What do you think are the points or new approaches that could help solve the refugee or the displaced and the stateless problem? And I was asking, like, what are the approaches that you think should be dropped off? Like they're taking too much money, too much resources, and they're not working. Simple.
No, I think one of the things that I saw that a question was raised about finding creative solutions. We don't talk enough about stories about refugees, who they are as people, that we often lead with so-and-so is a refugee from Syria, or so-and-so is a refugee from this country or that country. We lead with their refugees, not that they're human beings, and they have so much more to offer to our communities and to our everyday day-to-day life, right? Whether that's in our religious organizations or schools or you name it. So I think we need to find ways where we're funding programs so that refugees can really their stories can be told, but they can be told about who they are as people beyond the fact that they're refugees, because that's not entirely who they are. Right. And so I think that gets lost, and that helps build that political will, because if there is civic support for supporting refugees, that political will then exists. Right. So there's got to be programming such as in the arts and creativity and solutions building in uncommon corners. Right. Technology is one of them. Supporting entrepreneurship is one of them. Supporting innovation and humanitarian response is one of them. But so is storytelling, and so is the arts, and finding different ways of sharing, whether it's the expression of their journey, but also who they are as humans, is incredibly important. Because I think what gets lost in the numbers and whether or not that it's solving a problem is that we're actually talking about human beings here, right? So I think that's critically important. I think that it's also holding governments accountable to the money that's being spent, and where is it going, and what kind of impact it's actually having. We talk about it's not having an impact, but we need to demonstrate that it's not having an impact. We also need to demonstrate where those dollars have gone, and if those organizations have been effective in really using those dollars. So I think those are two things that really would help.
To Gillian for her closing remarks. I would like to make a quick round again of these questions. Now, I want to check, like, all right, we're blaming the governments, rightfully so. That's a lot of points, because like addressing addressing the source of problem. Like, these people did not choose to be displaced, did not choose to be on the run. There was a problem. crisis, a threat that drive them there. If we don't address that, the more will be coming. But unfortunately, that will take us into a very long story. I don't think we have enough time at this point to talk about the political will to solve the problems and the issues. We talked about triggering creativity and online, talking about or looking for refugees not as a refugee. That does not delete who you are. If you don't speak the language of a place, doesn't mean you didn't know anything. Maybe this is one of the hinders. Now, I want to ask, if we do self-criticism for civil society organizations, NGOs, and communities, where did we go wrong? Where did civil society go wrong? How far it actually served this cause, and where it can now put a print that really would change the course. I will go again in the same order. Shadia?
Okay. So it's difficult to criticize civil society who really serves communities wherever they are. But my only thought might be is that every single member of the civil society should place on their agenda refugees. So look at your business purpose or your civil society purpose and tell yourself and ask yourself the question, am I servicing refugees and the displaced? Is there a way that in my model I can actually include them and provide the service which I'm meant to provide by including them in some way or another? And I'm sure there is a way for every NGO and every single member of that civil society. So I would say that would be my thought of what the criticism could be for that.
Right. Very quickly, Sahar?
Yeah, it's easier for me to be critical just because we do advocacy and not operational on the ground. But I feel like sometimes with every crisis, we have to reinvent the wheel. There's definitely a lot of ways, and I don't want to seem, very critical of the civil society, but there are some reforms that are needed definitely within humanitarian organization, within the UN system itself, when it comes to more transparency, more accountability, the hierarchy, less hierarchy. And for me, the most important thing is empower local groups, give the power and the ability for Lebanese groups in Lebanon, Syrian groups in Syria, and so on. Because most of the time, as one of the speakers mentioned, ultimately, international are going to leave and go on to the next crisis, but the locals are going to stay. And so we have really to empower these, local groups much more, in my sense. Yeah.
All right. Okay. I'm going to start with the question before I go to you, Christine. Of course, if you have anything to add, because we have a lot of interaction from our audience, thanks to you and your ideas and insights. This is a question from Claudio Fernandez in Brazil. And the question goes, anti-immigration sentiment has been used as a tool to increase nationalism and homogeneity for political gains. How can we build a counter narrative that values diversity and human rights as fundamental for development, peace, and poverty reduction? We quickly touched on that with Shadia, but Christine, love to hear your thought on that.
I think it's about creating opportunities in two ways. One is creating opportunities where local citizens can have interaction with those who are seeking refuge in communities. So creating pathways where people can get to know the other and realize and find that they have more ties that bind them than separate them. Right? A lot of this conjecture around nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment is based on myths and half truths and just outright wrong things, right? And so for you to kind of be able to put together people in a room who might on the surface seem very different, but actually they can find ties that bind them as human beings. That breaks down those walls, because then they'll each go and tell each other one about the other. The other thing is funding the arts. And I think in creating opportunities for stories to be told so that people can see cultures that they may not have the ability to come in contact with in their own community and see those ties that bind on screen. You know, I think about these platforms, whether it's Netflix and YouTube and you name it, they've got global reach, and there's an ability to tell stories across the globe that can bring us all together. And I would emphasize, you know, it's really important that we talk about why people are fleeing and tell those stories about the journeys that they've gone and the persecution. It may just not be of conflict, right? It may be because they're from the LGBTQIA community, and so we're telling that story. But at the same time, we have to tell the stories of their people, because I think if you really can talk about that we're human beings first, and we really have a lot more in common than we have different, then we can really overcome some of the nationalism sentiments and the anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Great, thank you very much for your answer. Because do you wanna actually respond to that, Jalen? That was a question from one of our audience about the anti-immigration. Just let me find again. Did you hear the question, or should I try to find it again?
I did hear the question. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
I think you know that if I may, I will make some concluding remarks when you're ready to do it. But I think this point about sort of, in a sense, populist politics, the misinformation, the myths, and the outright untruths in this post-truth world we live in is a serious problem. And in my former job and in this one, I have to say, I think that I've become increasingly interested in the combination of two things. One, telling the story, which many of us do, the photographs and the stories that emphasize humanity and the essential humanity of the people we're talking about and the contributions that they're making to society. But in addition to those stories that move the heart, you have to have the evidence of what's actually happening. And the more data we have, the more disaggregated data to understand the nature of this unprecedented movement of people, I think the better we're going to be in a position to counter the misinformation and the lack of truth. Now, I have to say that I'm always an optimist, but I'd have to say that there are many contexts in which, of course, the truth doesn't make any difference. We have to have a combination of appealing to hearts and minds.
Right. We can go into your closing remarks, Jalan. It's actually time to do that, but thank you for your answer. So it's a combination of appealing to heart and minds. Jalan, there was some criticism about the work of the UN, and maybe also like the whole construction of it, like the system of it. What do you think of that? And how do you answer that? And how would you describe the work of the civil society so far with what we heard from our panelists and speakers, and of course many others? What would you take from this session into the G20, the government and the international bodies to take responsibility on, and I would say the big businesses as well, the big companies, maybe social media and online and website, you know, like the new realities, the new giants of our world. Do you think we should include them in this conversation, in this responsibility?
Well, thank you very much. And may I say, I really think this has been a very fruitful discussion. It's been terrific to hear the views of all of the panelists and to hear their different perspectives and the different kinds of approaches that they would take to this the suggestion of creativity, of finding solutions. And I think it's actually been very good for me to listen to this discussion, because I do become engaged in so many discussions in which we describe the problem, but not enough emphasis going on exactly how we're going to deal with it. And many people, of course, have talked about root causes. And I think in a curious way, COVID has forced us to think a little bit more about root causes and about the nexus of a humanitarian response to people on the move with development. And I say that for a particular reason, and that is that, as you probably all know, resettlement places have declined in any event, but even more so as a consequence of COVID, because the UNHCR has not been able to resettle people for some months, although we've now resumed. But we have two problems. One is that the traditional, if you like, branded work of UNHCR of resettling people, finding a durable solution, has become very, very close to impossible. And also, so many of the conflicts that we deal with are protracted conflicts. So certainly Syria, 10 years, Afghanistan, 40 years, the position of the Rohingya now in Bangladesh, having left Myanmar, 3 years, and so on, through Africa and Latin America. One of the difficulties is that voluntary repatriation has also become difficult. What that leaves us with is the enormous role of inclusion, and to require a host country to include in their own systems requires a huge level of development assistance. Of course, UNHCR does the emergency work, a million bars of soap to Burkina Faso, tents, shelters, food, wash to those displaced in Idlib. All of that work is done by UNHCR, of course, but we want to see more effort now in encouraging investment. And that brings me to a point that I think has been sort of touched on very briefly with regard to the role of responsibility, the wider society of business. And that is that we really want to work now more closely with the international financial institutions, the banks, the World Bank in particular. We have to broaden the scope. We can't just be in a silo of people working in civil society on refugees and displaced people. We have to work with business leaders. We have to work with politicians, with influencers, religious groups, parliamentarians, local mayors. I think I'd like to see, it is exciting to hear this discussion today, but we need to join it up more. And we need to be talking to the big business as well as small to medium business, which of course is where much employment comes from if we're talking about integration. So I'd like to finish, if I may, because I know time is very much of the essence. But I think a very important point is being made that is emerging also in part out of COVID, and that is the empowerment of local groups. I quite take the point about short-term funding. We are trying to work at UNHCR to solve that, to get the money down to NGOs in the field, in operations, in communities. And I think empowering local communities is absolutely fundamental, which is another reason why, of course, I was so keen to be part of this event, because it is about working with civil society at the local level that I think is going to be enormously important. There's also a point about accountability. Of course, there's accountability of the business community, of the corporate environment, of governments, but also there's accountability of civil society as well. And that is that we must look to ourselves. If we want donor dollars, I think we've got to be more prepared to show what it is we're doing for that dollar. We perhaps haven't been as good, and I'm speaking about UNHCR, we perhaps haven't been as good as we might in the past of showing exactly how that money is linked to an effective outcome that's achieving what we need to achieve with regard to stateless people, gender-based violence, and so on. So look, I think I must bring it to an end here, but I like the idea of looking at more creative opportunities. Let's look at trade opportunities. Let's look at education, complementary pathways, other solutions, because I think it was perhaps Henry Ford who said, if we keep doing the same thing, don't be surprised if we get the same answer. I think we need new ideas, new thoughts, bring in more young people, bring in the compassion, but bring in the the scientists, the people collecting the data, bring in the financial institutions, and see if we can somehow join this up a bit better. To go back to that stimulating idea that was put, if China can bring hundreds of millions out of poverty, we can do this. We just have to find the mechanisms to do it and to develop the political will. So thank you all so much. I've immensely enjoyed the discussion, and I'll take up a lot of these ideas back to UNHCR, and I hope to meet you in the flesh before too long. Thank you, Zena, and Christine, and Sahar, and Shadia. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much, Gillian Fergus. It was extremely a pleasure to have you and hear your thoughts. It's good to close on this optimistic and open, inclusive, actually, note that we welcome everyone, and we need to welcome everyone in all kind, the heart and mind, new businesses, creative people, scientists as well, just to hear them, to hear their thoughts. We cannot just do it the same and expect different results. Well said. Thank you so much, Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection and Operation at UNHCR. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much, Christine. Okay, I just lost the picture of Christine, but I hope you can hear me. Christine Mendoza, she is CEO of Humans on the Move. Thank you so much, Christine. Sahar Atrash, Senior Advocate for the Middle East Refugees International. Thank you so much for joining us and for all your insights and thoughts. Shadia, thank you so much. Shadia El Mayouchi, board member and Teach for Lebanon. I really thank you for all your innovative and stimulating thoughts and ideas. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for everyone who was connected with us. I'm looking also forward to meet you in flesh, but it is okay. Virtual is doing fine for now. Thank you all. That was the end of this session. So the right to belong, the unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Thank you.